Hi there, it's Fred and Fred. Thanks for tuning in to Guitar Media, and welcome to Guitar Media's Guitars of the 80s video. We're here today to take a look at some of the best 80s guitars that we have, and talk about a few others. We'll try to keep this as close to chronological order as possible. The Fender Lead Series was first introduced in 1979 and would span through 1982. This series was designed to be more price point competitive, as there were many more available options of import guitars at that time. In 1980, Ken Hoover would also release and launch the Zion Corporation, Zion Guitar Technologies. In the late 70s, Jackson would actually move into Charvel's repair shop, shortly thereafter purchasing the company and adding Charvel name-branded guitars to their catalog in 1981. Floyd Rose would also have his first prototypes in the late 70s, eventually releasing the tremolo patented system and production lines by the early 80s to the public. also be a major competitor in the tremolo systems of the guitars of the early 80s. And we always like to see Kahler made in USA models on certain guitars. This very often confirms that the guitars are not only early and legitimate 80s guitars, but also typically higher end models, as they were available on Gibsons in 1983. The Fender Bullet was yet another budget-friendly option in the early 80s, first introduced in 1981 and spanning through 83 and 84 reportedly. These guitars often would have a plywood body and a metal pickguard that would also make up part of the bridge system, available with many different pickup configurations, including the classic Fender single coil, as well as a double coil humbucker system that was also switchable from single to humbucker modes. And we have even seen factory X1 pickups coming in some of these Bullet guitars, which is really amazing, because the X1 guitar pickups were typically designated for the top of the line instruments at that time. Fender would also have the Strat, a really cool model we like to see around the year production of 1980, and these guitars were offered with gold hardware as well as a matching headstock. I've seen them in Candy Apple Red, Lake Placid Blue, and Shoreline Gold, most often seen with a maple cap. Gibson would also offer an additional line to the Explorer and Flying V models in 1979, the E2 and the V2. These guitars would have a 5-way plywood body and were designed by Tim Shaw. The V2 would have the boomerang pickups, while the Explorer would have the dirty fingers pickups typically. The Gibson Sonics was produced from 1980 to 1984, and during its introduction proved to be the most affordable price point Gibson guitar offered at that time. The models would be the standard, the deluxe, and the custom models. These guitars would also be offered with the famed Bill Lawrence Velvet Brick pickups. And some of the other guitars were actually offered from the factory with Zebra Dirty Fingers, which is a way cool way to get an affordable price point guitar with the Dirty Fingers pickups. Often we see many guitars that came from the factory with Gibson Dirty Fingers pickups modified for phase switching as well as coil tapping. Because of the design of these pickups, they were double lead style pickups, so these complex wiring configurations were available, but we can't leave the Sonics 180 without mentioning the factory phase switch on the custom model. The Gibson Artist Series would include many different models. Produced from 1977 to 1982, it featured active electronics designed by Bob Moog, including compression, expansion, bass boost, and treble boost. Pro 2 guitars, first launched in 1975, produced by Matsumoto in Japan, were actually a direct reflection of the soon-to-come guitar corporate internationalization. And what I mean by this, let me explain. So, Gibson and Fender, right around the time of the mid-80s, would actually be bought out by other companies. And in this process, what happened is the companies would incorporate the use of more affordable models, including imports and export models. And so these companies would actually be moved to Korea. And this is why the Matsumoto was shut down in 1987. And although it doesn't say that, I draw this conclusion just based on these time frames. Guitar Corporation Internationalization. Such a great topic, and in the mid-80s. But before we get too far ahead, let's jump back to the reissues of the Gibson Explorer and Flying V. These guitars would first be produced in 1958, and in the early 60s, a rising demand for their production would bring them temporarily back into production, with some of the older parts that weren't used being used. However, we don't see the reissues until 1976 with the first reissue of the Gibson Explorer marked limited edition. This guitar would spark what later would become the Heritage models. And the Heritage models are widely the first reissues from Gibson for so many models, including the Les Paul and the Flying V. These guitars were produced more accurately to the original models, including the construction and even the types of woods and pickups that were being used. This would lead to the Carina wood being brought back to the production of the Flying V in 1981, as well as the Explorer in 1981. In 1983, these reissues would be renamed the Heritage Series, and this Heritage Series would also include the use of the Carina wood. And while this guitar that we have here today is not a reissue, the custom shop models would also be a limited edition and even made in less numbers than the reissues at that time, and would also feature Carina wood in 1983. So this is kind of a big pill to swallow. Artist endorsements. It's something through the early 80s that became a major power factor in the guitar worldwide market. And with Eddie Van Halen specifically endorsing Kramer guitars, somehow Kramer guitars were able to become the most popular and successful guitar company by the mid-80s. And I don't think this is really a coincidence if you look at the worldwide market of guitars and other companies like Ibanez and so many other companies, Hondo, and really just so many other companies, like I say, were being produced in Japan in the early 80s, leading up to this, the way that the artists were using the endorsements to create this super brand of Kramer. And then so what happens is finally the corporations are like, look, we've had enough. You know, this is ridiculous. We're losing an insane amount of money. And they actually ended up getting bought out. And so we see the corporations coming out with these new models like the Squire and the import made in Japan Fender guitars, and even made in Korea. And so many companies going to Korea at that time. It was like, it was almost like the whole guitar world was upside down. So everything changed hands and changed locations. And really, this actually brings us to the Epiphone. It's just too much to really talk about all at once. So I'm sorry, somehow we skipped over the Gibson Designer Series, which they also had an Artist One-Off Designer Series line, which is very interesting because we see some guitars that we've never seen before because there were just so few of them made that sometimes when you see one, it's the only one you've ever seen, which is really awesome. And we always love to see unique guitars. And these guitars also came with the Dirty Fingers pickups and were produced mostly right around 1984 and 1985, right before the sale of the company from Norland to the new owners. But just jumping back once again to the, to explain why I say, this era of changing hands in the mid 80s was depressing. It's actually not because guitars wouldn't be good guitars. It's not because Gibson guitars wouldn't be good guitars or Fender guitars wouldn't be good guitars. Although I do personally prefer CBS Fender guitars over the newer Fender guitars. It actually has a lot more to do with the guitar amplifiers of that time. For me, I'm just so much of a classic amplifier lover, and it actually goes back to the 59 Bassman, and it's the way that Fender would use point-to-point circuits through the CBS era, and that was basically done away with, and sometime in 1984 and 1985 when CBS was done away with, and they would go to the circuit board amps, and it was just, these amps just did not sound as good as the Rivera era or the previous CBS era, in my opinion, with the point-to-point era. And the same goes for Marshall. The JCM 800s was actually just an evolution and a revolution of the 1959 Bassman, and this circuit that would be done away with in favor of the JCM 900 and circuit board models that were already really coming in a decade earlier, the printed circuit board models, but just the tone, it was just going down the drain. And, of course they brought it back with the reissues, but we have to leave well enough alone. All right, so finally we've gone full circle. So we're back to the Zion guitar. And this Zion guitar we have here with us today, the bridge pickup was replaced by a humbucker out of an Epiphone Wee-Vee, because the original humbucker was DOA and had an open somewhere. So we got it back up and running, and it's in this really cool color, blue marble frost, which is probably one of the best names for a color that I've ever seen or heard of. And other than that, it's an ebony fingerboard, and really the only guitar that we have here with a full locking system. Now we don't use the locking system. We just tune it like a regular guitar, and we try not to use the fine tuners. And I believe some of the system is sort of frozen or locked up, and so we haven't been able to adjust it properly, but it plays pretty good. So this is actually kind of a really sad story, but it's not all bad news. This mark in the mid 80s, when all these companies were changing hands, it sort of kind of marked the beginning of the end. And I don't I don't mean that to be too depressing, but what I'm talking about is CBS, essentially the end of CBS and the end of Norlin as the owner of Gibson. So we see Gibson moving to Nashville at this time in 1986, and I'm really not sure if the custom shop was already there or not by that time. But regardless, Epiphone and Gibson's headquarters by 1986 was in Nashville, Tennessee, and this is after Norlin had sold the company. And what Epiphone would do, what Gibson would do, is they would make these guitars in Korea by Gibson. So this is a really cool and rare guitar made in Korea, this Epiphone Flying V. And these guitars actually had a Stratocaster style tremolo. And it's very interesting because if you look at Randy Rhoads' guitars, you'll also notice that he doesn't use locking tremolo systems on his guitars, which I found very interesting just because he was using the Jacksons that we typically do see locking tremolo systems on. And I think it's just because of the force and power that Eddie Van Halen had on the guitar market at that time. It just inspired them to put more locking systems. So finally, our conclusion here, to each their own. Let us know what your favorite 80s guitar is, or your favorite guitar if it's not 80s, in the comments. Regardless, just let us know. And for me, what really makes or breaks a guitar is the pickups, and that's really what it comes down to, because there's just so much I can do with the frets or the neck or the tuners or the bridge, but the pickups, it's either doing it for me or it's not. And so starting with the lead 3, I'm very happy with these pickups. They're humbucker that are switchable to single coil as well as in and out of phase. They work very well and are not overly microphonic whatsoever. And then moving on to the White Bullet S2. This guitar has the X1 pickups and they're very hot and not microphonic. And I'm overall very well pleased with the pickups in the S2. And then moving on to the H2 Bullet. These pickups have an incredible tone, and they're actually the redback Fender, red bobbin Fender pickups, and they sound absolutely, the tone is unbelievable. But, however, in humbucker mode, they do have proven to be microphonic, and we actually ended up waxing them to eliminate this issue, and that was very successful, although not 100% successful. Moving on to the Explorer, this guitar's got the Tim Shaw pickups, and definitely regrettably the most microphonic out of all the guitars. And really, it's really sad, and we haven't gotten around to waxing the pickup, but it's just not. The Explorer, sadly, is just not usable with gain. You basically just have to play clean. And we play very loud, and we turn these amps up. We do not use distortion pedals or lower volumes. We're basically just running these amps wide open. And so if a pickup's microphonic, it's a huge issue. It just doesn't work for us at all. And then moving on to the Epiphone. The Epiphone's got the Zebra, and I can't remember if what they call them, the power stacks, or what exactly they are. But overall, I'm very pleased with the Epiphone Zebras and the 1986 Flying V2, and they're not overly microphonic and very usable and very recognizable for 80s. You sort of get this buzzsaw tone that we all have grown to love through the years. And then moving on to the Charvel. The Charvel, well, actually, I'm getting out of order. The Zion. The Zion, of course, the pickup was changed in that, and it's a very hot pickup and not overly microphonic and definitely gets the job done. And so for the Charvel, it's got the EMG 81s. And for me personally, I'm not exactly sure if they're all like those, but I just hear this sort of a, it's a very strange, sort of a hum after every time when he stops playing it. And I really don't like it. And I've never been a fan of very hot pickups anyways. And so once again, to each their own. They are very professional and usable pickups though. If that's your thing, great. You know, I'm glad that you like it. Once again, please let us know what your favorite 80s guitar is in the comments, or your favorite guitar even if it's not an 80s guitar. And what we do here is we run this guitar and these guitars and get our 80s tones with the Studio 15, running the settings pretty high to the point of microphonics, and we sort of dial it back until we don't have that issue. We also have the Fender M80 here, a transistor amp that we use on some of the recordings, as well as the original Crybaby by Jim Dunlop. We also use the 1970 Marshall Super PA 100 watt amp, and we run it pretty much wide open. Our speakers here are the 1969 Celestion T1217s. Our close microphone at 18 inches is the Sennheiser E835. Our room microphone is the Nady RSM4 ribbon microphone. So forgive me for jumping around, but this is just mind-blowing how a company like Kramer, basically started sometime in the late 70s and basically just out of nowhere, all of a sudden becomes the top-selling guitar by the mid-80s in the world, and then boom, in 1990 and 91, they bankrupt and they shut down. The company shuts down. So out of nowhere, straight to the top and then straight in the tank, just like that. And it was basically all in about a 10-year span. But so anyways, moving on to this Charvel guitar that we have here today, we believe that this is the late 80s, and this guitar is a plywood body, and it also has the EMG active electronic system, as well as a Stratocaster style tremolo. And oddly enough, we don't really know if the neck is original to the body, and we don't know if they're made in the same place. It's very strange. The neck appears to have the Kahler system locking nut, and so this suggests also, along with the finish, that it may have come off of another guitar. And then jumping back over to Charvel, so here's a company they actually started out in California, and they were made in USA, and they were special order guitars, and much like Carvin, for quite some time, for nearly a decade. And then in the late 80s, all of a sudden we start to see the import necks. So all of a sudden it's bodies from Japan or necks from Korea or this or that. And then they're assembled in the United States, and then God only knows. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, in the late 80s, they Carvin internationalized along with Jackson, and it was actually very strange, because I think I actually even vaguely remember a Jackson guitar that was made in Vietnam, and so who knows, like in the 90s, exactly where they were made, but the bottom line is they felt the effects of this internationalization along with the rest of the world. So just another confirmation of this entire thing taking place. Edward Van Halen. You are looking at a true legend and a man that changed the industry with his endorsements for Kramer. So here's a company that came from nowhere. Now by the mid 80s, they're the top selling instruments in the world. And it actually forced Fender to internationalize. So they were working in Fullerton, California. And next thing you know, the company is sold, and they're opening up in Berea and Corona and just everywhere. In Mexico, they got guitars, import guitars from Japan. They're opening up the Squire line by 86 or 87. And, just guitars are being produced in Korea. It's amazing. It's like an explosion. And so he paved the way, literally, for every guitar player in America to have a guitar in their bedroom for $100, like with the Squire, or even maybe, who knows, maybe even less than that. And I'm just looking at this. I mean, there's so many other companies too, like Gibson. They were in Kalamazoo, and here they go, New Orleans sells out, and they move to Nashville, and Epiphone, it was made in Japan, and now, production is being moved over to Korea, and so many other companies, even like Area. So Area was made in Japan, and, they basically got shut down by the late 80s, along with Kramer, and just a handful of others. But we see so many, and even Ibanez, they're another good example of this happening and taking place, because Ibanez was made in Japan, up until the in the early 80s, and then in the late 80s we see Ibanez going to Korea. And this is very interesting. I'm looking at this Epiphone guitar that I bought, and I brought up a price sheet from the mid 90s because I couldn't find one any earlier, and one from Japan, and it was the Japanese yen, so it was about roughly 35,000 yen for an SG and 36,000 yen for a Flying V at that time in the mid 90s. Well, I crunched the numbers to see what exactly that was in US dollars by converting it from yen exchange rate in the 90s to US dollars, and it came out to like I think it was $235 for the SG and $240 for the Flying V. And I did the inflation rate. I crunched the numbers from 1995 until today, and it came out to it was like $440 or something like that. It was like 1.8 was the inflation rate. And so if you look at that number, okay, I'm not exactly sure if it was $440, but if you look at that number roughly, you're right in there with the price point of today's Squier Classic Vibe. And I'm talking about this because Gibson and Epiphone, in my eyes, have really lost touch with the reality of where the price point should be for an entry-level guitar. And whereas the Squier Classic Vibes are, in my opinion, under 500. Bottom line, under 500, is where they should be. And I mean, it used to be like I had a friend in the 90s, and he would say, you get what you pay for, and that used to be true, but now it's just not that way anymore. And it's like Epiphone was made in Korea, and they made some really good guitars, and then they were made in Indonesia, and now they're made in China, and it's just not the same. A lot of these Squier Classic Vibes are made in Indonesia, and they're just better guitars at a better price. And so I really think that it's just my opinion that Epiphone needs to rethink the market and the price point and just reconsider where they should be. I mean, they've come a long way from 1986 and 1987, but they've come too far, though. If you'd like to support the channel or see some of our videos ranking higher in the Google and YouTube search engines, please like, comment, and subscribe, as this is absolutely free and the best way to support the channel. If you'd like to see more of our videos, we have several YouTube channels, including Guitar Media, Guitar Media 2, Guitar Media 3, Music Media, and the EDM Fred Sweet channel, where you can search and find many more of our videos. Thanks for watching, and check our channel for our latest videos.